opens lines for development, aiming for central control and a foundation for queenside expansion. Developing a knight to its most natural square, this move prepares for central pawn breaks and offers immediate flexibility against white's central pawn. Developing the knight here sets up central pawn expansion while preparing to castle. Preparing fianchetto, this pawn push anticipates king's side development and aims to control the long diagonal. Pinning the knight here pressures black's kingside development, potentially creating weaknesses later. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the fianchetto, preparing to challenge white's center with a future, e5 or c5. Developing the knight to d2 supports the central pawn thrust and prepares kingside castling without blocking the bishop's diagonal. Embracing central space, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens diagonal lines for piece development. Bolstering the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares for development. Aggressively challenging white's central pawn structure immediately, aiming to disrupt the king's pawn and create dynamic play. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move prepares to develop the queen's bishop and contest central space, a cornerstone of classical opening play. Bringing the queen to b6 immediately targets white's c3 pawn and creates a dynamic central tension, forcing a response. Challenging black's queen immediately seizes central initiative, potentially disrupting their pawn structure and forcing concessions. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for eventual pawn breaks presents a robust strategic foundation. The bishop retreats, seeking more active diagonals and reinforcing the central pawn chain. Securing the monarch is a wise prelude, anticipating potential central skirmishes and the development of aggressive piece play. Castling tucks the king away safely, clearing the way for potential central action or wing advances. Solidifying the pawn center, preparing to challenge white's queenside ambitions and aiming for harmonious piece development. Bolstering the kingside, the bishop now eyes a crucial diagonal, preparing for potential pawn breaks and greater kingside influence. Initiating a strategic repositioning, the knight prepares to reinforce the central pawn structure and potentially pivot towards the kingside. Solidifying the kingside and preparing to potentially contest the important d-file. This repositioning aims to bolster the kingside and potentially activate the rook on the open e-file, seeking counterplay against white's central pawn structure. Gaining crucial space on the kingside, this rook aims to join the queenside pressure and solidify the pawn chain. Repositioning the queen to the d8 file anticipates potential central pawn breaks and prepares for a more active role in the upcoming middle game skirmishes. Puzzling, white preemptively secures the queenside, but it feels like a tempo lost when central pressure is key. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while preparing to develop the queenside bishop. Seeking central influence, white repositions the queen, preparing potential queenside expansion or a central pawn break. Developing the bishop to this diagonal now offers it excellent scope for future pressure on white's queenside. Challenging the queenside pawn structure opens avenues for central tension. Consolidating knights behind the pawn wall, this maneuver prepares to contest the central files and potentially launch a kingside sortie. Preparing to launch an assault on the queenside, this bishop repositions for maximum impact, eyeing potential weaknesses. Unleashing a knight to g3 creates immediate pressure on white's queenside and eyes the vulnerable king position. Reclaiming central influence and preparing a kingside advance by reinforcing the bishop's pressure. Shifting the queen, black aims to reroute it for central influence or to support a potential pawn break. This establishes immediate central control, preparing for potential pawn advances and eyeing open files. Exploiting the pawn chain's weakness, black ignites central activity, forcing a critical decision on white's king safety. Shattering the central pawn structure, this capture opens lines but creates immediate imbalances and potential weaknesses for both sides. Reclaiming central influence, black redirects knights toward a more active presence, promising dynamic counterplay. Liberating the bishop, this exchange reshapes the central pawn structure and opens a dynamic diagonal for your piece. Reclaiming the central square with the bishop solidifies the pawn structure and eyes the d3 bishop's influence. Opens a dynamic diagonal for the queen and bishop, challenging black's pawn structure and creating immediate tactical possibilities. Reopening the b-file creates dynamic counterplay and reestablishes piece activity for black. Unleashing central aggression, this pawn thrust aims to seize space and disrupt black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the center with this recapture unravels the pawn structure and immediately sets up a dynamic struggle for central control. Liberating the knight into open territory, this establishes an immediate pawn threat and seeks to unravel the queenside. Opening up the c-file for your rook offers exciting counterplay, but be mindful of the e4 pawn's new attacking potential. Reclaiming central space and opening lines for the bishop while forcing a decision on the knight is the idea. Unleashing the knight to the edge opens a dangerous diagonal for white's king and prepares a counterattack. Securing the bishop's diagonal creates a vital outpost and supports a potential knight advance. Liberating the bishop from its passive square, this move ignites central counterplay and aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. Securing the file opens lines for the rook, a proactive step towards centralizing your forces and asserting influence. Opening the c-file allows white potential counterplay against your castled king. Shedding the bishop opens diagonals, creating dynamic attacking possibilities on the king side. Reclaiming the central square tension, this recapture revitalizes black's queenside initiative after the exchange. Reclaiming the central square with the queen sharpens the pressure on black's kingside and opens up attacking lines. Repositioning the bishop to d6 clears the path for the rook and prepares for future pawn advances. Stabilizing the pawn structure offers a moment of respite, preparing for a potential kingside assault. A cautious redeployment of the bishop, seeking refuge from potential tactical skirmishes on the open diagonals. Liberating the e-file opens attacking lanes for white's rook. Recapturing the pawn on b8 immediately reasserts pressure along the open file, challenging white's recent pawn grab. Liberating the back rank, this capture opens the rook's full potential while simultaneously simplifying the pawn structure and initiating an endgame transition. Reclaiming the open file solidifies black's presence on the queenside, preparing to contest the important central territory. Propelling the kingside pawn initiates a bold storm, seeking to dislodge the enemy bishop and create lasting weaknesses. Reclaiming the d-file centralizes the rook, preparing to contest open lines and exert pressure. Initiating pawn expansion on the queenside seeks to disrupt black's rook activity and gain square dominance. Reclaiming the central square with the queen is a vital step, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially prepare a pawn advance. Simplifying to an advantageous endgame where white controls the central squares is the goal here. Reclaiming the central file with the rook immediately puts pressure on white's weakened kingside structure. Reclaiming central space, the rook prepares to dominate the open file and pressure the king. Securing the monarch amidst the open terrain provides much-needed refuge from impending threats. A bold sacrifice aiming to expose black's king, gambling on tactical opportunities arising from the ensuing chaos. Recapturing the rook immediately reclaims some central influence, forcing white to reconsider their pawn structure. Reconnecting the knight to its defensive duties, though it sacrifices some central influence. A desperate attempt to stir up complications in a lost position, sacrificing material for phantom counterplay. Capturing the bishop clears a path for your knights and secures the pawn structure, aiming for a swift, decisive advantage. Reclaiming lost material, the knight now eyes the exposed white monarch, forcing immediate defensive adjustments. Knight centralizes, eyeing the unprotected king and opening lines for attack. Sacrificing a piece to open lines around the enemy king is a bold gambit, hoping to exploit exposed weaknesses. Recapturing the rook activates a powerful passed pawn on the 8th rank, Reclaiming the rook from that menacing diagonal opens up a critical file for counterplay. Focusing on king's safety, the monarch vacates a dangerous diagonal, seeking refuge behind its remaining pawns. Unleashing a central pawn push to potentially disrupt white's king's safety. Asserting dominion over the queen side, the rook initiates a decisive penetration into black's shattered defenses. Reactivating the rook on the newly opened file, the challenger aims to disrupt white's king's safety by forcing exchanges. Recapturing with the knight allows the white king to become more active and pressure the isolated pawn. Pushing the passed pawn forward aggressively, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay. Asserting control over the open file, the rook now endeavors to penetrate black's weakened queenside defenses. Black's pawn aggressively advances, aiming to steal open the king's defenses and gain initiative. Reinforcing the knight's outpost on d3 solidifies central control and prepares for a potential passed pawn push. Reactivating the knight to a more aggressive central outpost, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially threaten the king. Centering the king offers it a safer haven from the active black pieces and supports potential pawn advances. The rook now eyes the weakened kingside, ready to exploit the awkward pawn structure. Seizing the c2 pawn, white aims to solidify control of the crucial passed pawn. Seizing the open file, the rook initiates a desperate counterattack to disrupt white's pawn push. Targeting the vulnerable passed pawn with the knight now pressures its advance and potential support for the king. Re-establishing the pawn's pressure on the queen side, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Navigating the pawn passed with precise knight placement now. Securing the passed pawn's advance, the rook aims to support the knight's regal advance on the 7th rank. Reactivating the knight to eye weaknesses on the queen side opens up new tactical possibilities and strengthens white's attacking potential.